I can find it.
It's 11:59 at Radio Free America, and this is Uncle Sam with music and the truth until dawn. Right now, I got a few words for some of our brothers and sisters in the occupied zone. The chair is against the wall. The chair is against the wall. John has a long mustache. John has a long mustache. It's 12 o'clock, Americans, another day closer to victory. And for all of you out there on or behind the lines, this is your song.
And welcome everybody to our Daily Gun Show. We try to come to you live every weeknight. Today, not at midnight Eastern, and we talk about what the Second Amendment protects. And on Mondays, our goal is to talk about the Second Amendment media, content creation, offer some motivation and some inspiration, and whenever possible, have interviews, conversations with people in the community, people in the industry, and people who are getting stuff done. So this week we have Alex Ooley on from Forge of Freedom, and also an attorney from Indiana, also a regular guest on the Play Society podcast and maybe other places I don't know about, but someone who's been active in my radar for a while, but he'll let us know how long he's been around. But I want to first off say thanks to the people joining us live. We do this live on YouTube so that we can use the interactive features that are available to us here. Also, thanks to everybody joining us in the podcast realm out there. We always appreciate the people that give us feedback, that offer the likes and thumbs and whatever the mechanisms are out there that let the platforms know that you appreciate this. It helps our stuff get recommended. We do appreciate that. But if you're joining us live and you have questions for Alex, feel free to leave them here. And towards the end of the show, we might be able to grab onto some of those. If you've listened to our show in the past, you know that when I do an interview show with someone for the first time, I attempt to give them the hour to offer their why and their how, and to make this participatory to some extent, but to give them some time to just explain their why and their how. So often, people anyone who's doing stuff, when they get invited onto someplace, they're brought on as an expert in their field or to talk about some issue that's happening or some event. And it's almost always a reactionary. It's not usually something that they instigate or that they bring, that they can bring up the topic themselves. It's always some other topic that they're there to speak on. And that's kind of unfair to the people who have amazing projects going on and interesting work, and they're getting a lot accomplished. So what we try to do is give people an opportunity to talk about their why it is they do what they do, and then how they do it. And it's up to them to, expand into that as much as they want. So without putting you too much on the spot, Alex, thanks again for for putting up with my technical issues today. But thanks for joining us.
Oh, no problem at all, Pete. I'm happy to come on the show. Thank you so much for the invitation. This is something I'm passionate about. I love talking about firearms and about freedom more broadly. So happy to join the show and happy to be here. So thanks for having me.
Right on. Well, I'm going to ask you to maybe give us an elevator speech, the stuff that you would use if you were introducing yourself at an occasion, but to take, as much time as you want, but be, fairly brief, because I'm going to recommend that people go listen to the Polite Society podcast on Fridays. You're typically on the Legal Fridays, right?
Yes.
And then you've got a podcast. You will talk about that. But again, just to give people an idea if they haven't been introduced to you before, and then then we'll stop and we'll let you have a real time to talk about the whys behind what you do. But go ahead, please let us know who is Alex and what's Forge of Freedom.
Yeah, sounds good. So this is actually the first venue or forum where I've really talked about who I am and why I'm doing what I do and how I do it. I often on the podcast talk about ideas, and of course that's what I want to focus on. I never want a podcast to be about me, primarily anyway. But of course, I think it's useful to listeners. I like to know about the people I'm listening to, so I'm happy to do that. I guess really I'm relatively new to Second Amendment and firearms media. I've been a firearms instructor for a little over a decade, but I didn't start the podcast until this year. I started the Forge of Freedom in January of this year. We've got, I don't remember the exact number of episodes, but nearly 80 episodes now. And every Monday, I release a firearms-related episode, and every Saturday, I release a more broadly freedom-related episode. And I started really podcasting with Paul at the Polite Society podcast. He invited me on when he was doing Polite Society News as the bullet. Of course, it's just Polite Society News now, but I've done quite a few episodes with Paul, and that's really how I got started in podcasting. I've been an attorney since 2017, and I practice primarily in the area of criminal defense, but I also do handle self defense cases as well as other firearms related issues. I wouldn't consider myself a firearms attorney. I don't do regulatory compliance. I don't help FFLs and gun dealers and things like that, but I do help people with the restoration of their firearms rights. So things like expungements or issues where maybe they've got a crime of domestic violence and they need a restoration of rights with respect to a crime of domestic violence. I do that sort of work as well. So that's what I do day to day. And the podcast is really just a very part-time gig for me. Like I said, about 2 episodes a week. But I started the podcast because I really have a passion for liberty. And firearms are a large component of that, but that's not all of it. Obviously, there's a lot more to freedom and to liberty than firearms. And frankly, there are a lot of great firearms related content and producers out there. I mean, there are so many podcasts, great podcasts, including yours and Paul's, among others. So I wanted the focus to be more than just firearms. I thought, what can I bring to the table that's maybe different than what somebody else might be bringing to the table? So uh, part of what I bring, I think, is a philosophy of liberty and freedom, as well as the firearm. And I try to bring that philosophy of liberty to the firearms discussions as well. I have a degree in philosophy. Obviously, I have a degree in law. So I try to bring those as sort of distinguishing viewpoints or things that color my coverage of firearms and freedom. So that's really what I try to do with the podcast, Forge of Freedom. I just had an episode released today with Paul Lathrop. He was the guest. I'm usually the guest with Paul, but he was the guest on the Forge of Freedom, and that was just a show about Paul and how he got started in podcasting, how his efforts in the gun world have evolved, and why he continues to do what he does. And so that's really what I'm about and why I do what I do. I'm happy to get into more detail there, but I don't want to hog the stage too much here.
Right on. Well, you got the stage, so I appreciate that for the break, though. But we got your YouTube on the screen here, and you've got the. So we've got. You can talk about being a lawyer, the attorney. Why you decided to be an attorney. There's the why there, and that's a pretty important element of the United States with individual freedom and liberty. I think of it as we all have our individual freedom, and maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this is you're a good person to ask about this, but I always think of, I've heard it kind of described this way, but we all have our own individual freedom. Liberty is the way that we all work together. So we all have our freedoms, and they all kind of, like jigsaw pieces or like pieces of a pie. They fit together to become a bigger thing. That we all have individual freedom, but we all share liberty together, and that doesn't just happen. It'd be nice if it just happened, but nobody's delusional. Nobody's on the same. We'd be a hive mind if it was like that, right? So in order to litigate, is that the right word? In order to arbitrate, in order to facilitate that working together, and sometimes it takes a partial third part, an impartial third party, is that the way to say it, to help when there's clashes or conflicts. We have the bureaucracy, which nobody likes half the time. And then we have the people that interact with that, accountants, attorneys, others. So we could talk about that decision. But then, as far as the activist side, I'm curious, what was the spark? What's the how, or not the how, but what's the why behind you kind of briefly went into it, but behind the podcast?
Sure.
Sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. So starting really this goes back a long way, but starting really in junior high, I kind of had my mind set on joining the infantry. the Army infantry. I wanted to be in the military. I wanted to fight what I considered to be noble, for noble causes. Uh, as a high schooler, I applied and was accepted to the United States Military Academy at West Point. And while I was on an official visit at West Point, at my hotel room, the presidential debate, the Republican primary presidential debate, was on, and I heard Ron Paul talk about the concept of blowback, and his it's a pretty famous snippet from that debate, his debate with Rudy Giuliani, who was, of course, seen very favorably in the wake of 9/11. And it was really the first time I'd heard about this concept of blowback, that our intervention in affairs worldwide isn't without consequence. And I'm not anti-military. I'm not anti-soldier. I think that I would consider myself anti-intervention. I think that our military should focus on defense. Um, and based on Ron Paul's debate and his argument there at the debate, I got to thinking, and I did study. I sort of reflected on what I wanted in life and what I wanted to achieve, and it set me on the path toward small L libertarianism. And a key component of small L libertarianism is this idea of self ownership and non aggression. So the idea is that as individuals, we have superior ownership in our bodies as compared to every other person. And that's important to remember, as compared to every other person, not to God, not to any other higher being, depending on your beliefs. So people don't have other individuals have no authority to dictate what we do with our own bodies, except insofar as we harm others. So the role of government really was meant to address that, and to prevent people from harming others, and to, as you said, sort of fill some very limited and specific roles. And that's things like military for defense, and for defense only, not for offensive purposes, police for the enforcement of the law, and courts to resolve disputes among people. So obviously, today our government is a behemoth. It's grown far beyond that. We see that not only in the firearms realm, but in lots of other ways. And really, after I decided not to go to the United States Military Academy, that was what I planned for years and years, and I dedicated hours and years of my life toward that goal.
Oh, can I
And
interrupt? What year?
oh,
What
sure.
time frame? What time frame are you talking about? What year?
So that would have been, I graduated from high school in 2008. Um, so that
Okay,
would have
so
been when I
definitely
decided
not
not to go
a
to.
knee-jerk reaction to war on the 9/11, but this is after a few years of
Right.
okay.
Yeah. So after 9/11, I would have considered myself a pretty mainstream Republican. I was in favor of the war in the Middle East. The first vote, I'm not proud of this, but my first vote as an 18-year-old was for John McCain, who, of course, was very pro war. Uh, and as the years went on after 9/11, uh, I started to question what our mission was abroad. What was really the purpose and the mission of our foreign policy? And I just decided that if I wasn't fully committed to that mission, that I couldn't commit my life to it. And so when I decided not to go to the United States Military Academy, I was sort of at a loss about what to do, and what direction my life would take. But I started studying libertarianism. I started studying political philosophy, John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, all sorts of economic, political philosophy. And like I said, I got a degree in philosophy. And uh, as I studied these things, more and more, my passion turned toward liberty and toward freedom, because I think that we see with our own eyes empirically that government does very little good. Most goodness in the world, most things that are worth living for, come about from our voluntary relationships with other people, not through coerced interaction, not through government intervention. And in fact, I think the government oftentimes impedes progress and impedes those relationships we have with other people. Whether you think about the welfare state or the war on drugs or any other number of government interventions, I think that it tears apart at the fabric of society. And so my goal really with the podcast and my motivation for talking about freedom was to spread the ideas of liberty, because I think that liberty isn't something that comes about without effort. It's not something that comes about just by happenstance. It's something that has to be strived for. It's something that has to be preserved, and it's something that has to be won back. I used to have it as part of my intro to the podcast, but there was a quote from Ronald Reagan that said that liberty is not passed on in the bloodstream. It's something that has to be won again and again, generation to generation. And that's where the forge of freedom really comes from. It's meant to capture this idea that freedom is something that has to be earned. It's something that is only won through effort, through friction, through continual effort. And I think that stems primarily in the arena of effort in the development of our personal character. And what I mean by that is that we can't have liberty if we don't have character. And normally, the impetus for government control is to prevent people from doing bad things. And if people aren't out there doing bad things, then there's no reason for government. So the more that we can develop, refine, and enhance our personal character, each one of us, the less we need government. And so it's my goal through the podcast to spread that message to as many people as possible, to enhance my own character through talking about these ideas as sort of a self-reflective practice, and to inspire people to hone and reflect on their own character, because character is simply the sum of our actions, our thoughts, our actions day to day, the way we treat others, the way we try to enhance our own lives as well as others. And so that's really the goal, the inspiration behind the podcast and the goal of the podcast.
Right on. Appreciate that. I am a person that goes live a lot, so and it's almost always just live conversations. So it's very difficult for me to not just interrupt and stop and to make this a conversation. So I made a bunch of notes as we're chatting here. I'm going to let you keep going. And again, thanks everybody that's joining us live. DJ's throwing links and Kingpin threw links down. So appreciate the people that are helping to moderate the channel. I was going to that when you just said, and I'm going to paraphrase it poorly, but you said something like, without bad people, there's less need for government. That's an interesting point. I'm not sure you could do an entire show on that. Can I ask, and I kind of alluded to this before, how would you define individual freedom and liberty, and how do they interact? I tend to throw those around loosely. So as an attorney and as someone who's paid attention to this in more ways than just that, how would you define individual freedom and then liberty?
Yes. So freedom is the condition in which individuals can act without restraint, according to their own values, according to their own wishes, according to their own goals in life. And freedom is really, so that's how I would define freedom. But freedom, I think, is what makes life worth living, because without freedom we have no choice, we have no responsibility, we have no purpose. And freedom, well, let me back up. If we live in an oppressed state, a state of intense control, we don't have the opportunity to do good or bad. We just simply act as we're told. We act as we uh, are forced to. And so freedom is the condition where we can fulfill our own purpose, our own desires, and live a life that's fulfilling and gives us meaning and purpose. And so I think that while there may be some benefit, as some might say, to having a powerful government that tries to stamp out the bad in the world, I think, first of all, the government is completely ineffective at doing that. And the worst atrocities ever in humankind have been committed at the hands of government by far. So even the supposed benefit, I think, is a fantasy. But even if there were some benefit to having a powerful form of government that tried to oppress the bad in the world, I still think it would not be worth it because people could not have the condition of freedom to fulfill to live a fulfilling life and to fulfill their purpose according to, like I said, their ideas, their values, their goals, and their purpose. So that's really my overarching uh, case for freedom. And I think is that it provides the conditions where people can live a life of fulfillment and purpose. And you see the antithesis of that in even in the United States, where by and large we live relatively free lives, although I think a little less and a little less each day as the government expands. You see, especially in certain microcosms, that people who especially live from government support, who have no responsibility, who have no family, who have no purpose, who have no meaning, they live very sort of depressed lifestyles and oftentimes resort to drugs. I see it every day. I handle criminal defense cases, many of which are drug cases. And oftentimes people use drugs because they feel like they have no purpose, they have no meaning, and they have no way to live a fulfilling life. And I think that's largely because the government has displaced the family, they've displaced the need to work, to find purpose with welfare, etc. Um, and so eh, I think that freedom is essential for our own individual flourishing as well as our collective flourishing. Uh, Liberty, I, I think there is some case to be made that liberty means something different. I use the words mostly interchangeably, but eh, I think that I think I
It's
can't.
just like a different name for the same concept.
I would use it as the same as the different name for the same concept, but I don't want to misstate what you said earlier that
Oh, I don't know. I'm
freedom is.
trying to put it in my own, just I'm just trying to put words on those concepts, I guess.
Yeah, gotcha. But I would use them interchangeably. Um,
Right on. Well, I appreciate that. We don't have to spend, it doesn't have to be a quiz or a lecture or anything. I just wanted to take a second to, because we're about halfway through, and you are, I don't know, you're new to the scene relatively, and I hope you don't take that offensively. I've just been watching it
oh
for a
no,
while.
not at all.
You consider, like the people that have been in since the 70s that are still kicking, that started their organizations in the mid 70s. They're still kicking. So, all of us are new to the scene. But the how part of it, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to touch on or elaborate on there, or just, again, I'm making this open. So, anything about the how, like when you decided to do the podcast, when you decided to do, interact with Paul on the Polite Society podcast, and the other things that you've worked on, the hows, is it difficult, easy? I can kind of leave it open. So,
Well, I'd had it in the back of my mind that I would start a podcast like this. It wasn't always going to be the Forge of Freedom, but it evolved into that. And it really came about when after I got married. I got married May 2022, and I'd been talking to about this idea with my wife, and I committed to her that I was going to do this. That this was something that was really important to me, and so I think that by just saying out loud to her that I was going to do that was sort of an accountability mechanism. That okay, now I've said this. There's somebody else out there that's going to see me through this. That now I have to do it. It's not just an idea in the back of my mind. It's something that I've said I'm going to do, that I've committed to. And so there's a lot of unknowns when you get started in something like this. What kind of software do you use? What kind of microphones do you use? What kind of camera? What kind of lighting? Uh, how do I get guests? All sorts of impediments and reasons that you could use as excuses not to get started. And frankly, that's what I'd been doing for a long time. I was letting the idea of the perfect be the enemy of the good. And at some point I just felt like I'm gonna start, even though it's not gonna be perfect. I'm gonna be bad at it to start. I'll get better as I go. And so I just started. I decided I was going to start January 2023, and I released my first episode in January of this year. And the first episodes that I released were really foundational episodes. Why did I start the podcast? Why freedom? Why do I care about these things? Where I just talk about the things that I just talked about for a little while. But then I slowly started to get some guests, including Paul most recently. I know you had Jeff Knox on last week, who's a great asset to the firearms community. Obviously, most people that listen to your show probably know Jeff Knox, but he's a petition candidate for the NRA Board of Directors and was able to make it on the ballot. So I hope that he and the other 3 reform candidates are able to get elected and have some success, because I think that the NRA is important for our gun rights, our right to keep and bear arms, even though that it's not in good condition right now and under poor leadership. We need good people to be in place to take it over, either when it's goes bankrupt or who knows. I mean, there are a number of things that could happen, but we need good people like Jeff Knox to be in place there. So I'd want to point your episode with him. I want to point that out from last week. That was an excellent episode. He was also on the Forge of Freedom before the ballots were due, or the petitions were due. And, I've talked to Stephen Hallbrook. One of my favorite episodes about guns was with Jacob Hornberger, who's lesser known in the firearms community. He is the president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and he wrote a book called The Tyranny of Gun Control. And I think it's a great book. It has a mixture of philosophy, economics, and sort of more mainstream gun rights ideas. So I think it's a wonderful book and a great episode to go back and check out. So I think things just sort of came together organically after I got started. I had lots of hesitation getting started, and like I said, I wasn't the best at. I'm still not the best at it, but I think I'm getting a little better each day and with each episode and each guest. So it's something that I do mostly in the evenings. I have a pretty full caseload for my day job as a lawyer. And this is really just a passion project.
So one of my questions would be then, is this something that, I mean, you went to law school, and that's a feat. Most people look at well, I mean, none of us have done it. So most people look at that as a huge mountain to climb. So you've already accomplished some things that most people consider too much effort. But is this something that a project like a podcast, is that something that you've done before, or is this out of character?
It's really out of character. I am very introverted by nature. I don't like to speak publicly, which is interesting for an attorney, right? Especially one that does criminal defense. I'm in court a lot of weeks, 4 days a week. But this was really out of my comfort zone. I think it's I don't know. I'm not a huge Jordan Peterson fan, but I like some of the things that he says. And one thing that he said that I thought was interesting was that if you don't say what you're thinking, then you can never really test your own ideas. And then secondarily, you never really are you. If you don't say what you're thinking, if you don't express yourself, then you're never fully you. And I think that a podcast is useful for that purpose because even if nobody's listening, it forces me to sort of reconsider my own ideas, to express them. And by doing that, I think I'm honing my own ideas, and then also uh, secondarily getting better at expressing them. So I think that a podcast is useful for lots of reasons. And of course, if people listen and get something from the things that I have to say, then that's a great byproduct.
Right on. That kind of leads me to a question I had that I wasn't going to, I don't know if this is the right order, but it kind of falls into it. So you have a cadence and your word choice is precise and that's unique out there. Is that something that, I mean, obviously you're not acting, so it's just the way that you, kind of the way that you speak, I guess, and the way that you talk. So is that something that you saw was missing? Is that intentionally that you brought it to the field, or is it just something that came along with you when you started doing your thing? For what it's worth, it's refreshing and I think very needed on the scene. We see a lot of other approaches from other legal sources out there.
It's something I've never even considered until you just mentioned it. So it wasn't intentional at all. I think it's an interesting point, and just sitting here thinking about it, I think that it probably developed during law school primarily, maybe a little bit before that, but it was probably honed during law school. I did mock trial and moot court competitions, and for those who don't know, moot court, a mock trial is self-explanatory. It's a fake trial, but moot court is a opportunity in law school that most law school students have, where you get a case, a fake case, and you have to argue one side or the other as an appeal. So it would be the equivalent of arguing before the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals or the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals or the Supreme Court. So you actually stand in front of a panel of judges, sometimes 3, sometimes 5 judges, and you make the argument for your case. And they pepper you with questions as you're making the argument for your case. And so I participated in that uh, moot court program, and I think preparing for that, practicing for that, going through that competition forced me to really think before I spoke. And I think that's where the cadence comes from, because you're really hearing my words as I'm thinking. And that sounds ridiculous or sort of obvious, but you're really hearing the words at the same pace that I'm thinking the words. And I think that there's some saying, and I'm going to mess it up, but you should think before you speak, so that, because it's better to trip over your feet than over your tongue or something like that. And so I've really sort of tried to embrace that lesson in my speech.
Right on. And I didn't mean to imply anything or suggest it's a superpower either. It's just everyone has their skills and attributes, right? Their characteristics, and it's much valued when everyone participates because of this kind of. I think this is an example of how we all gain from everyone participating. Maybe along those lines, when you did the podcast, do you consider it a legal podcast, or on a podcast from an attorney? I mean, you can't help it that you have that credential. You don't like flaunt it or anything that I've seen in the branding or anything. But when you started the podcast, or as you think about the podcast, and I'm just using this as sort of a question, I guess. I don't know what kind of question this is. Are you do you consider yourself joining the ranks of the other attorney podcasts out there, or are you adding something new to the pile?
Not not really. Obviously, I bring that perspective to the podcast, but it's not my primary lens. I'm happy to sometimes talk about cases that are going through the courts, but I generally try to talk about things that are more evergreen, things that if you listen to the podcast 50 years from now will still be relevant. So that's my preferred uh, angle with the podcast, but I do sometimes throw in some more current events things, including some legal topics, but it's not my primary focus. I think that's another area in the gun rights world where it's saturated with good content. You've got, the likes of Mark Smith and Tom Grieve and other attorneys who I think bring in the armed attorneys in Texas who bring, I think, good perspective to current events, and I do that some, but it's not my primary mo.
Right on. And I hope that by shining light on it, I didn't affect it or anything, because I appreciate and I hope I'm speaking for other people. I'm assuming I'm speaking for at least a couple other people out there, but hopefully I'm speaking for a lot of people that it's appreciated. I like having options and alternatives, and I guess everybody's in it for different reasons, and maybe follows different recipes or has different ideas of what's cool or what works. But your approach is refreshing and uh, well, appreciated. I don't know the word used. Addition to the mix. And for what it's worth, I also would not consider you an attorney podcast, other than I think you have to take some of it because you do the legal stuff with Paul, and you have that credential. I think it's like a lot of things when you've got a certain, like a doctor, you can't not talk about doctor stuff because a bunch of doctor stuff, and to some extent you're like legally bound to something. So there's right, like you can't just act like you're not a lawyer, I guess.
Yeah,
Or
that's right. Sometimes I carry that as an asset, the JD, the lawyer um, designation as an asset, but sometimes it's a stigma, and sometimes it's not necessarily an asset. Sometimes I think attorneys have a tendency to overthink problems and to uh, I think sometimes get sandboxed within legal theory and I think have a hard time thinking outside of the box about what should we do versus how things are. And so you see that a lot, especially when attorneys talk about case law. That we're bound by these certain ideas or principles that have been established by the Supreme Court or by other courts or by legislatures, but that's not necessarily what the way things should be. And I think attorneys sometimes have a hard time escaping that. So I think, for me anyway, I like to talk outside of the box sometimes because it forces me, I think, to be more creative and to be more maybe bring a broader brush to the topic than sometimes people would get from a purely legal discussion.
Right on. Well, hopefully I didn't. My other question here was from earlier, and I was leaving it for later. We're getting close to the end of the show. First, I'll let you know that you can have as much of the show as you want to. Maybe address anything that came up or you thought of or you want to go back to. But my last question, I guess, that I'll ask, and if there's any questions from the people joining us live, feel free to ask them. And if you're listening in the future, you're just doing this in a time warp, but you can ask Alex all the questions you want by going to his platforms and asking them. But if you're here live right now, then go ahead and leave some questions in there. We'll address them if we can. My last question, though, is I guess the whole the theoretical legal quagmire. You don't have to spend too much time on it, but it came to me as you were speaking earlier. And I fall into this problem all the time, or this situation all the time. I think a lot of us do. I agree with you pretty much on a lot of your positions that you've talked about in this show and on other stuff that I've seen. But there are people that don't, what's the word? They don't cherish freedom. They might not even want freedom. They think it's a burden. And in a free country, they're allowed to have that. So I guess in a country where freedom is an option, not a requirement, how any, again, take as much time or as little time on this as you want, but how do we work with people who legitimately have a right to have the opposite opinion of us? And just because we have opposite opinions doesn't mean they're wrong. It just means that their position is alien to us, but they're allowed to have that position. And if they want hive mind, if they want giant government, how do we work together? Because right now what we do is we have a lot of people that, in my opinion, I don't want to get off on topic, they exploit the divisions, they exploit the rifts, and they don't try to solve anything. How do we work with the people that just don't want freedom?
I think that's a great question. I've got a few points to make here. Number one, I think you're right. Some people prefer the calm of despotism to the tempestuous seas of liberty, right? That's the quote from, I think, Thomas Jefferson. For some people, that's their preference, and that's fine. I think part of the reason I started the podcast, part of the reason I talk about freedom is because I feel like, as somebody who is familiar with the idea of freedom, somebody who understands the peace, the prosperity, the flourishing that it can bring to the world, and the harm, the despotism, the turmoil that is brought by the alternative, I think it's my duty, my obligation to talk about those ideas. And I think that if people are exposed to those ideas, they will be compelled by them. I think the people who prefer despotism just don't know what it means to be truly free and the sort of fulfillment that they can get from it. So it's like I said, I think it's my obligation, my duty to talk about these ideas. And of course, I would never, part of the philosophy of liberty, right, is that you would never force your ideas on someone else. And so I think that we are limited to talking about these ideas and hoping that people absorb them. But on another point, I think that in many ways, the founding fathers of the United States were genius, and that was part of the idea of federalism, was that each state and every component of government down to the local level was sort of a laboratory of ideas and a laboratory of human interaction. And I think that that's a huge component that we've lost little by little over the decades and centuries since our founding. And I think that as the states and local governments have lost more control and more control has been ceded to the federal government, we've lost that ability to live in smaller communities that govern and hold similar values. And I think that the more decentralized government is, the better it is for the most people. Because if control or government control rather, is decentralized, it's easy for me to move to the next county that governs differently than it is for me to move to the next country. And so I think I think we need to get back to that more decentralized form of government so that people in New York City can live like people in New York City want to live. And people in rural Southern Indiana can live like people in rural Southern Indiana want to live, and that neither one is controlling the other. So I think that's really from the perspective of how our government should be formed and how our government should operate. I think getting back to the more local form of government, the more federalist form of government, I think is the way forward. Because frankly, that's why there's so much division in our country, is because there is so much power in the hands of the people in Washington, D.C. And they're trying to govern for the people in New York City, just like they're trying to govern for the people in Southern Indiana. And they should have very little control over either. And so I think that's really the way to go forward.
Wow, awesome. Those are great answers. I throw questions out there. You never know what's going to happen. So appreciate that. And I mean, obviously we don't script this, but I think if somebody would have done difficult to write all that up ahead of time. So thank you for that. Can I ask, do you think, what's your, I ask this often when I watch conversations that are live. I throw this in as a question in the text chats. What's your, if you can, you don't mind me kind of going from the conversation back to kind of where we're at today, where do you see us as Second Amendment, what the Second Amendment protects and all that encompasses, not just guns, but all the stuff that what the Second Amendment involves. Where do you see us in 2023 going into 2024?
I think that while the Bruin decision from the United States Supreme Court was widely celebrated, uh, and I do think it was a good decision for liberty, especially for the folks that live in Southern Indiana. It had no effect, or very little effect, but in New York City, it had huge effect, or at least hopefully does. The problem is that, and this is going beyond 2024 even, uh, is that now, through incorporation of the Second Amendment, the federal government has exerted de facto control over the landscape of the Second Amendment. And the incorporation doctrine is a whole nother topic for discussion. We could spend hours talking about incorporation doctrine, but essentially it means that the Bill of Rights also applies to the states or to state government actors, not just to the federal government. And I think that's dangerous for a few reasons. It's like a fox in the hen house, to some degree. The Bruin decision was good, but what happens when the composition of the Supreme Court changes? I think that the tide of Second Amendment litigation could easily change in the other direction. I mean, think about how fragile it is just right now. If there's another Democratic president in 2024, who knows what opportunities that president will have to replace certain justices on the Supreme Court. And we don't want our rights to be bound or limited by Supreme Court jurisprudence. So I think people should, and this goes back to my earlier points about local governance, I think people should become more active at the state and local level, because ultimately they will be the protector of freedom, not the federal government. And so I think that while so many people focus on national news and things going on in federal government, I think we need to pay a lot more attention to what's going on in our own state government and county government, city government, because that's where, if the federal government decides to repeal the Second Amendment, the states can still protect the right to keep and bear arms. And so that's going to be the last bastion of freedom, is at the state and local level. So I think at least through 2024, we're in good hands with the Supreme Court, but we don't want to uh, take it lightly, take the right to keep and bear arms lightly. And I think that ultimately we need to redirect our focus to state and local government.
Right on. And as from your perspective, I ask this a lot also. What's your, without tainting the question, what's your opinion, or what's your, I guess, opinion of what's the opinion of the potential that we have of the people who've been in the global war on terror for the last 20 something years, various types of veterans coming out, having an intimate experience with the bureaucracy and lots of its different forms, entering into, let's say, being representatives, and is there potential that that'll change the paradigm from, right now we have a lot of geriatric representatives.
Yeah, I'm encouraged by a lot of the young people who are entering politics. I think that there are many veterans who have fought courageously in the war on terror, but also at the same time realize that they've been used primarily as political pawns, unfortunately. And I'm not detracting from their service. I think it's unfortunate. I think one of the best things, the most patriotic things that the government could do for veterans is to bring them home. And I think that many veterans realize that. John Lovell comes to mind from Warrior Poet Society. I think he would be in that camp. I haven't heard him talk about it extensively, but that's just an example of somebody who cares about freedom, who cares about uh, the preservation of our liberty and the preservation of our country, but nevertheless questions our intervention abroad. And so I'm optimistic in that regard. I think as more new blood gets into Congress, obviously you'll have fewer people with entrenched interests and people who have developed sort of corporatist, crony capitalist relationships. And I'm a capitalist, but I'm against the intermingling of government and capitalism because that results in cronyism, where companies lobby for special treatment and special benefits. So I think that as the older crowd is weeded out, I think there will be less of that, hopefully. And maybe I'm looking at the situation with rose-colored glasses, but I'm optimistic in that regard anyway.
Well, I mean, people call me optimistic. I think it's realist. We've had issues with monopolies in the past. We've had issues with all kinds of things, and capitalism and the way that our government and our society works is we've moved on past those things. We've adjusted course and corrected and moved on. So if this is an issue that's been around I think for decades, not hundreds of years or anything, it's been around for decades. It can be corrected, and let's see, every crack is something that crumbles the whole thing. It can be repaired, and sometimes your repairs are stronger than it was originally. Go ahead.
Oh, I see a comment here from.
Yep, that's what I was going to end. So we're getting close to the top of the hour, and I do appreciate your time, but be respectful for your time. We'll wrap it up with Guns and Water. As you noticed, I've had this on the screen for the people that are listening to a podcast. I'll just read it, and then it's not really a question, but it's the closest thing we got today from live viewers. But I think it's a great way to just read it. You can give your whatever you want on it, and then we'll wrap it up. So, Guns and Water, thanks for this. The shame about freedom is the root word free. Freedom costs a lifetime of work. Freedom ain't free. Most people say there ought to be a law. That's a big problem.
Yeah, I think that far too often people say exactly that. There ought to be a law without considering what that really means. That when they say there ought to be a law, what they mean is that if somebody violates that law, men in government employed by the government should show up with a gun to enforce it, and that you may, in fact, spend time in a cage for violation of that law. And I think if people put it in that perspective and looked at it through that lens, they'd be far more reserved about saying there ought to be a law, because that's really what they mean. Because ultimately, that's how a law is enforced, is at the point of a gun by a government official. Obviously, it would go through the courts, but if you're non-compliant, how is it enforced? At the point of a gun. And so I think that people ought to step back and consider what they are really saying when they say there ought to be a law. And to the other point, freedom is not free. It has to be won anew at every generation for it to be preserved. And like I said at the beginning, it's not something that's passed on in the bloodstream. It has to be forged through individual effort, through the development of our character, and through the proliferation of the ideas of freedom. So I think that's where I'll leave it for now. I would point to one podcast episode that I did. I think it was episode 40 with Lawrence Reed it was episode 40, and it was called "Are We Good Enough for Liberty?" And Lawrence Reed, he was the president. He's currently the interim president of the Foundation for Economic Education, fee.org. It's an organization in Atlanta that talks about capitalism and free market ideas and voluntary exchange. But he was in Poland during when it was still the Soviet Union, before the wall came down and before the Soviet Union collapsed. And while he was in Poland, he was part of an underground operation to spread the message of liberty. And it was called in memory of his efforts there was a project called the Blinking Lights Project that got started because they would take radio broadcast and move covertly through the night from place to place in Warsaw, Poland, so they would not get caught, and broadcast news from outside of the Soviet Union, real news, and talk about liberty and freedom to try to motivate people to fight for their freedom and to stand up against the despotism of the Soviet Union. He was ultimately arrested and spent some time in prison. And he has been an advocate for freedom worldwide and especially in Poland ever since. And he was recently awarded the Grand Order of the Cross of Merit in Poland, which is the highest honor bestowed upon a foreigner by the country of Poland. But he talks about, in Are We Good Enough for Liberty, episode 40, about why character is so important for the preservation of liberty. And so I'd encourage your listeners to go check out that episode and read his book. It's a relatively short book, and it's available for free by PDF.
Right on. We did get another question from DJ. It's a good one. But if I can use this to coerce you to come back again, and we can have another conversation. Because there was a couple of things I was going to ask you about that are no point in bringing them up at this point in the conversation. But he had a question about the key cases that might be coming up. So, without going off on that tangent, if you're willing, we'll start the next conversation with that one.
Yeah, I'd be happy to come back.
Right on. So with that, I was just going to also, I guess I'll throw something in there that when they talk about there ought to be a law, they're also implying that the state is the ultimate resource to decide what ills are. And obviously, who decides what the next ill is.
Yeah, exactly. We certainly don't want the state to be the arbiter of morality.
But with that, I'll say thanks again. I'll mention we're able to do this without any ads or without any other influence other than to say thank you to the people that subscribe to what we do. Our Patreons, our YouTube channel members essentially subscribe to our projects. They buy me a cup of coffee each month. They buy us lunch, $5, $25 a month. That adds up and it accumulates, and we're able to pay for the servers that we use to keep the websites out there. The main projects are our websites out there, our main resources, I guess. But we do the social stuff as regularly as possible and these podcasts. So we do appreciate the people that make it possible for us to do this, like old-fashioned PBS, with people that, value it, throw a couple of bucks, capitalism, and we can just essentially say thanks to them and not have to encourage you to buy anything. Although that being said, it is Black Friday, or Black Friday week, and we do have one of the reasons we're able to do this at all is our efforts over on Amazon. So we'll have links all over the place for our Amazon store. If you're going to buy stuff on Amazon this week anyway, we encourage you to use our store. Gizzard Gary, our friend who does the live chats on Friday, he has a store. Check his store out. And if you're going to make a large purchase, head over to Gizzard's store. Enter through that store. Amazon takes care of all the work. They know that you were recommended by him. You sent them over, and they give him a thank you with finances, with money, and that helps us do what we're doing. With that, thanks everybody for joining us. I'm going to let Alex end the show here. Let us know what, first off, if I forgot to ask anything. Should I have asked anything? Is there anything that, with further thought, you wanted to elaborate on?
Oh, no, not at all. I enjoyed the discussion. Thanks for having me on, and I'm always glad to come back. I enjoy the chat and engaging with your listeners. The feedback has been great, and I'm happy to answer their questions and get into the last question there maybe at the beginning of the next show or throughout the whole next show. I'm not sure we could talk about that for quite a while.
Yeah, but exactly. Sounds like a whole nother conversation, right?
Yeah, exactly. But people can find the podcast obviously on YouTube, on Facebook, on Rumble, and on just about any of the podcast streaming platforms. You can also find the websites and all the podcast and all the show notes at forgeoffreedom.com. And then I'm also relatively active on Twitter at Forge of Freedom. So thanks again, Pete, for having me on.
Right on. It was a pleasure. And thanks everybody for joining us live or in the future. I'm going to throw a quick commercial up here for our store just so we have a thing to end it on. And Yeah, we'll look. Oh, next week we've got Brooke Cheney on from A Great Start Shooting School, and the Saturday project where she's done suicide prevention Saturday now for a number of years, a consistent effort on the 2 out of every 3 deaths with a firearm that the antis use against us are, of course, suicides. Brooke helps normalize the conversation so we can have, one, better conversations with each other to normalize mental health, but also have more effective conversations with the other side. Looking forward to that one.
GearWebsites.com is your source for firearms-based playing cards and books. We also have mugs, shirts, and posters with designs that we've made live. Of course, we have patches. Every Friday is Free Patch Friday. We appreciate your support. Thank you for shopping at GearWebsites.com.